After my son's death, I didn't tell my daughter-in-law that he had left me a $2 million house, and the night of my son's funeral, his wife didn't offer me a shoulder to cry on. She offered me a cup of tea and a promise. It was the promise, not the grief, that turned my blood to ice. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The rain beat a relentless rhythm against the tall windows of the house James had built, a rhythm that matched the frantic pounding in my chest. From the outside, our home on Lake Oswego was a masterpiece of craftsman design, all warm wood, sturdy stone, and sweeping views of the water. Tonight, it felt like a mausoleum. The air was thick with the cloying sweetness of funeral lilies and the damp chill of a Portland autumn. In the grand stone fireplace, the last embers of a once roaring fire glowed like fading memories. I sat in the worn leather armchair by the hearth, the one my husband, and later my son, had always claimed. My body was numb, a hollowed-out shell. Upstairs, my grandson, Lucas, all of 9 years old, had finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep. I wished for that same oblivion, but my mind wouldn't quiet. It kept replaying the last 24 hours, the synthetic green of the cemetery grass, the hollow sound of dirt on a coffin, the empty platitudes from well-meaning friends. The soft tread of footsteps on the oak floorboards pulled me from my reverie. It was Clara, my daughter-in-law. She wasn't wearing the face of a shattered widow. Her grief was tidy, contained. She moved with a purpose that felt jarring in a house so steeped in loss. In her hands, she held a delicate porcelain cup, steam rising from it in a fragrant curl. She placed it gently into my cold, trembling hands. The warmth was a shock. "Mom," she said, her voice a carefully constructed whisper, thick with artificial sorrow. "I know you're in pain. We all are." She knelt beside my chair, her gaze intense. "But this is James's house. It's my house now and Lucas's. I promise I'll take care of it just the way he would have wanted." She paused, letting the words hang in the air between us. Then came the final, gentle twist of the knife. "And I'll take care of you too, of course," she continued, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You can stay here as long as you need. Consider it your home." "As long as you need." The words echoed in the sudden silence of the room. They weren't an offer. They were a declaration, a granting of permission. She was a gracious host allowing a guest to extend her stay. In my own home. A chill, far colder than the Oregon rain, snaked its way up my spine. I looked deep into her eyes, searching for the grief-stricken wife of my only son. I found none. Behind the veil of her unshed tears, I saw only a cold, calculating control. The dying firelight flickered across her face, casting shadows that danced and writhed. For a fleeting moment, her carefully composed smile twisted into something else, a mask of triumphant ownership. I gripped the warm teacup, but the coldness inside me was absolute. This wasn't a promise of care. It was the opening move in a war I didn't even know I was supposed to be fighting. And in that moment, sitting in the heart of my family's legacy, I understood that I had not only lost my son, but I was now in danger of losing everything he had ever left behind. My mind reeled back, away from the cold promise in Clara's eyes, and landed 3 nights earlier. The silence of my own house was shattered at 2 a.m. by the shrill scream of the telephone. A call at that hour is never good news. It's a harbinger, a crack of thunder in a clear sky. I fumbled for the receiver, my heart already a frantic drum against my ribs. It was a nurse from St. Vincent Hospital. There had been an incident. My son, James. I needed to come immediately. I didn't even change out of my silk pajamas, just threw on a trench coat and slid my bare feet into loafers. The drive through the deserted, rain-slicked streets of Portland was a blur. Every red light felt like a personal affront, every second an eternity stolen from me. I left the car practically in the ambulance bay and ran, my lungs burning, into the harsh, fluorescent glare of the emergency room. A young doctor with exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes met me. He led me to a small, private waiting room that smelled sharply of bleach and fear. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mrs. Holloway," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm so sorry. We did everything we could. James suffered a massive cerebral aneurysm. He was gone before the paramedics even arrived." The floor fell away. The world tilted on its axis, a dizzying, nauseating spin. I remember sinking into a hard plastic chair, the doctor's voice a distant hum. He was talking about paperwork, about arrangements, but the words were meaningless noise. Then, he must have seen something in my face, because he pulled another chair close and lowered his voice, leaning in as if sharing a confidence. "There's something else," he said, his professional mask slipping for a moment to reveal genuine concern. "Aneurysms like this can be congenital, but the rupture, the timing is often triggered. In our experience, it's usually by a period of extreme, prolonged stress or a sudden, severe shock." His blood pressure was through the roof. He paused, looking at me intently. "Forgive me for asking, but was James under any unusual pressure lately? Any significant stress at work or at home?" The question hung in the sterile air, a seed of doubt planted in the barren ground of my shock. Before I could even process it, the door swung open. Clara rushed in, but she wasn't alone. Tailing her closely was her older sister, Eleanor, a calm port in Clara's manufactured storm. Clara made a show of collapsing, a dramatic, keening wail that seemed to echo unnaturally in the small room. But it was Eleanor who took charge. She moved with a chilling efficiency, a practiced grace that was completely out of place. She wrapped an arm around Clara, murmuring soothing words, while her eyes, sharp and intelligent, met mine. "Margaret, I am so sorry," she said, her voice a perfect symphony of compassion. "I came as soon as Clara called me. She's in no state to handle this." Eleanor was a therapist, and she played the part of the family's emotional anchor flawlessly. While Clara sobbed into her shoulder, Eleanor was the one who asked the doctor the practical questions. She was the one who turned to me, her expression a mask of profound empathy, and said, "Don't you worry about a thing. I'll go pick up Lucas from the house. He shouldn't be alone right now. You two just stay here." She was a whirlwind of perfect competence, too perfect. As she guided her devastated sister from the room to get some water, I remained frozen in my chair. The doctor's words, extreme, prolonged stress, ricocheted around my skull. I looked at the flickering neon light in the hallway, smelled the acrid scent of disinfectant, and saw the image of Eleanor, calm and in complete control. She wasn't just supporting her sister, she was managing her. It felt rehearsed, a scene she had played out in her mind 100 times. And for the first time, a terrifying thought took root. My son's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a convenience. The day of the funeral was draped in a fittingly somber gray. A persistent, misty drizzle fell from an overcast sky, clinging to the stained glass windows of the old stone church and making the world feel muted and suffocating. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old wood, damp wool coats, and the ever-present funereal lilies. Clara was the star of the tragic show. She clung to the side of James's polished mahogany coffin, her sobs echoing through the solemn space. It was a grand display of a widow's devastation, but to my newly suspicious eyes, it felt hollow, performative. Every time her wails threatened to subside, Eleanor was right there, a hand on her back, a whispered word in her ear, seemingly propping up her sister's crumbling facade. They were a perfect tableau of shared sorrow. My own grief was a quiet, heavy stone in my gut. I held my grandson Lucas's small hand, his own silent tears soaking the sleeve of my black dress. He was trying to be brave, but his small shoulders shook with the effort. I pulled him into a tight hug, burying my face in his hair to shield him from the sight of his mother's theatrics. It was in that moment, as I adjusted my embrace, that I saw it. It happened in a flash, a blink and you'll miss it exchange. The service was about to begin. Eleanor, under the guise of smoothing Clara's hair, leaned in close. Her hand moved with swift, subtle precision. From her palm, she pressed a tiny white pill into Clara's waiting hand. Clara, without breaking the rhythm of her soft sobs, popped it into her mouth and swallowed, no water needed. It was as smooth and practiced as a magic trick. My blood ran cold. An innocent explanation screamed in my mind. A tranquilizer, perhaps, to get a grieving widow through the worst day of her life. It was perfectly plausible, but it didn't feel plausible. It felt like a director giving her lead actress a cue, ensuring the performance would go on without a hitch. It was an act of control, not comfort. From that second on, I stopped watching the coffin and started watching Eleanor. Later at the cemetery, as the minister spoke his final empty words, my gaze drifted over the small crowd of mourners huddled under a sea of black umbrellas. I saw familiar faces, friends, former colleagues, neighbors. And then I saw Arthur Blake. He was our family's lawyer, a friend of my late husband's for over 30 years. He was a man I trusted implicitly. He wasn't looking at the grave. He was looking past it, his eyes fixed on Clara and Eleanor. The expression on his face wasn't one of sympathy or shared grief. It was something far more complex, a tangled knot of apprehension and, was it pity or was it fear? His gaze was heavy, knowing, as if he were watching two predators he knew he couldn't stop. When his eyes briefly met mine, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod before looking away, his jaw tight. The final handful of dirt landed with a soft thud. It was over, but for me, something else was just beginning. Standing in the cold Oregon drizzle, holding my grandson's hand, I felt a profound and terrifying shift. I wasn't just mourning my son anymore. I was standing on the edge of a conspiracy. The doctor's suspicions, Eleanor's chilling composure, the secret pill, Arthur's worried glance, they weren't separate, unrelated events. They were threads, and they were all starting to weave a picture I was horrified to see. I wasn't facing a grieving, grasping daughter-in-law. I was facing an alliance, a united front. And I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. A week after the funeral, we convened in Arthur Blake's downtown office. The room was a cliché of old money and legal power, floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, the scent of leather and lemon polish, and a heavy silence that seemed to absorb sound. It was designed to be reassuring, a symbol of stability and tradition. To me, it felt like a tomb. Clara and Eleanor sat across from me at the massive, polished desk, a united front. Clara had a look of barely concealed triumph on her face, a smug certainty that radiated from her. She was leaning forward slightly, like a runner waiting for the starting gun. Eleanor, as always, was the picture of serene composure, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She was there for moral support, but I knew she was the coach, the strategist whispering plays from the sideline. Arthur, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. He picked up the thick document bound in a blue legal cover. "Shall we begin?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. He started with the smaller items, his voice a dry monotone. The life insurance policy, naming Clara as the sole beneficiary. A portfolio of stocks and bonds transferred to Clara. James's shares in a small tech startup he'd invested in, also to Clara. With each item, the smirk on Clara's face grew wider. She shot a quick, victorious glance at me, her eyes glittering. She was getting everything she expected. This was just a formality. Then Arthur paused. He took off his glasses, polished them slowly with a handkerchief, and placed them back on his nose. He took a sip of water. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. "And now," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious register, "we come to the primary assets." He looked directly at me, then at Clara. "Regarding the property at 1450 North Shore Road, Lake Oswego, and the entire contents of the personal savings and investment accounts held solely in the name of James Holloway." He let the sentence hang for a beat. Clara was practically vibrating with excitement. "They are to be bequeathed in their entirety to his mother, Mrs. Margaret Holloway." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Clara's confident smile froze, then shattered. Her face went from flushed with victory to a ghastly chalky white. "What?" she whispered, the word barely audible. Arthur held up a hand, stopping her before she could erupt. "With the following condition," he added, his voice heavy. He leaned forward and read the next part slowly, deliberately, ensuring every single word landed with the force of a hammer blow. "Mrs. Margaret Holloway shall gain full and uncontested ownership of said assets only if, within 1 calendar year from this date, one of 2 conditions is met. 1. Mrs. Clara Holloway enters into a new marriage. Or 2. Mrs. Clara Holloway is deemed by a court of law to be morally, ethically, or financially unfit to have primary custody of her son, Lucas Holloway." He looked up from the paper. "If, at the end of 1 year, neither of these conditions has been fulfilled, the assets will be liquidated, and the proceeds divided exactly 50-50 between Mrs. Margaret Holloway and Mrs. Clara Holloway." The room imploded. Clara shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. The chalky white of her face was now a blotchy, furious red. "This is insane! It's a joke!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "He wouldn't do this! You're lying!" But my eyes weren't on Clara. They were on Eleanor. In the face of this legal bombshell, this declaration of war from my dead son, Eleanor did not flinch. She didn't gasp. She didn't even look surprised. She simply, almost imperceptibly, narrowed her eyes. A tiny frown line appeared between her brows. It was the calm, analytical reaction of a chess master whose opponent had just made an unexpected, dangerous move. In that moment, I finally understood. This wasn't a will. It was a weapon. James had known. He had known he was in danger, that Clara was being manipulated, that they were coming for everything. He couldn't fight them anymore, so he had left the fight to me. He hadn't given me a gift. He had pushed me into the ring and handed me a pair of boxing gloves. He was forcing me to go on the attack, to prove my own daughter-in-law was an unfit mother, just to keep the roof over my grandson's head. The 4 walls of Arthur's office closed in on me, no longer a lawyer's office, but a battlefield, and the war had just begun. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The heavy office doors slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the profound silence. For a long moment, neither Arthur nor I moved. I stared at the door, my mind a whirlwind of shock and dawning horror. I could still hear Clara's furious, strangled sobs fading down the hallway. Finally, I turned to Arthur. My voice, when it came, was a raw, unsteady whisper. "Arthur, in God's name, What was that? Why would James do this? It's cruel. It's a monster's will. He's pitting me against my own family, forcing my hand to take my grandson away from his mother. Arthur didn't meet my eyes. He sank heavily back into his leather chair, looking every one of his 70 years. He ran a hand over his face, the picture of a man carrying a weight far too heavy for his own shoulders. "I don't have all the answers, Margaret," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He began shuffling the papers on his desk, a nervous, pointless gesture. He was under a great deal of pressure. He wasn't himself the last few months. Pressure? What kind of pressure? I pressed, stepping closer to the desk. The doctor at the hospital said the same thing. "Arthur, you were his lawyer. You were his father's best friend. If anyone knows, it has to be you. You owe me the truth." He sighed, a long, weary exhalation of breath. He finally stopped shuffling the papers and looked up, but his gaze was fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "My duty was to my client, Margaret, and my client instructed me to draw up this will exactly as you heard it." My hands were tied. His evasiveness was a wall I couldn't seem to break through. Frustration and fear churned inside me. I felt like I was screaming in a soundproof room. Just as I was about to demand a real answer, he did something unexpected. He reached down and opened the top drawer of his massive desk. After a moment of rummaging, he pulled out a small tarnished brass key attached to a simple paper tag. It looked ancient. He slid it across the polished surface of the desk. It stopped just in front of my hands. "James gave this to me about a month ago," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He made me swear an oath. He said I was only to give it to you if and when you felt you were well and truly backed into a corner, when you felt you had no other moves left to make." I stared at the key, then back at him. "Backed into a corner? What does this open?" "A safe deposit box at U.S. Bank downtown. That's all I know," he said, though his eyes told me he knew more. He said the contents would explain things I couldn't. I picked up the key. It was cold and heavy in my palm, a solid, tangible piece of a puzzle I couldn't begin to comprehend. It was the last thing my son had touched, a final message from beyond the grave. A wave of profound loneliness washed over me. I was adrift in a sea of secrets, and my son had left me a map I couldn't read. I clutched the key in my fist and turned to leave, my mind already racing. But as I reached the door, Arthur's voice stopped me. "Margaret." I turned back. He was looking directly at me now, his eyes finally clear and focused, and what I saw in them made my heart stop. It was a look of deep, genuine warning. "He said one more thing," Arthur said, his voice low and urgent. "He made me promise to tell you this too. He said, don't trust anyone, not completely." He held my gaze. "Not even me." The weeks that followed the reading of the will were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The battle wasn't fought with raised voices or slammed doors. It was a quiet, suffocating siege. My own home, the beautiful house on the lake, was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a stage, and I was the unwilling audience to a meticulously crafted performance. Under the expert direction of her sister, Clara turned on a dime. The furious, vengeful woman who had stormed out of Arthur's office vanished. In her place emerged a paragon of motherhood, a saintly widow whose only concern was the well-being of her child. It was a transformation so sudden and so complete that it was utterly terrifying. Mornings were filled with the scent of organic, gluten-free pancakes and the whir of the blender making kale smoothies for Lucas. Afternoons were for patient, dedicated homework help at the kitchen table. Evenings were sacrosanct, reserved for reading classic children's literature aloud by the fireplace, Clara's voice a soft, soothing murmur. She politely declined every invitation from friends, sighing that her only priority right now is Lucas. Eleanor was the silent director of this production. She was a constant, hovering presence, always arriving with a thoughtful gift in hand, a new book on child psychology, a therapeutic board game for Lucas, a calming herbal tea for Clara. She would sit on the sofa, watching the domestic bliss unfold with a serene, approving smile. She was the devoted aunt, the supportive sister, the emotional rock for this broken little family. To the outside world, she was an angel. To me, she was the enemy's general, inspecting her front lines. Feeling like a spy in my own territory, I made a decision. I hired a private company to install a state-of-the-art security system, complete with discrete cameras in the main living areas. I told Clara it was for our safety, a precaution for a widow and a grandmother living in a large house. She agreed with a gracious, understanding nod. My real reason, of course, was to find a crack in her perfect facade. I needed proof that this was all an act. The cameras became my obsession. Late at night, long after the house was quiet, I would sit in my study, a glass of wine untouched beside me, and review the day's footage on my tablet. I watched for hours, my eyes burning, searching for a moment of anger, a flash of impatience, a single, unguarded second that would reveal the truth. I found nothing. The cameras only confirmed the story they were selling. I had high-definition, time-stamped evidence of Clara patiently explaining a math problem to Lucas. I had crystal-clear video of Eleanor and Clara laughing softly together as they baked cookies. I had footage of a picture-perfect family unit, healing from a terrible loss. The cameras didn't expose their lie. They validated it. They made me feel like I was the one who was going crazy. The narrative began to poison the world outside our walls. A neighbor I met while getting the mail commented on how wonderful it was that Clara was taking such good care of me. "She's a saint, that one," she said, patting my arm. A mutual friend called and spent 10 minutes talking about how brave Clara was and how difficult it must be for her, especially with the added stress. The implication was clear. I was the added stress. I was being painted as the villain in my own life story, the bitter, suspicious mother-in-law, making things difficult for the poor, grieving widow. I was isolated, trapped inside a suffocating play where every other actor knew their lines perfectly. And the worst part was, their performance was so flawless, I was beginning to doubt my own sanity. I was walking on eggshells in my own home, a prisoner in a gilded cage, and the walls were closing in with every passing day. The call came on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't Clara, but Eleanor. Her voice was a warm, gentle melody on the other end of the line. "Margaret," she began, "I know things have been tense. I was hoping you and I could step away from the house for a bit. Just us. There's a lovely little garden cafe in Multnomah Village. My treat." It was a summons, not an invitation, but it was wrapped in such a pretty bow that I felt I couldn't refuse without looking churlish. An hour later, we were seated across from each other at a small wrought iron table, surrounded by blooming hydrangeas and the soft chatter of other patrons. The air smelled of coffee and damp earth. It was a scene of perfect tranquility. Eleanor let the silence sit for a moment after our lattes arrived. She took a slow, deliberate sip, her eyes full of a deep, practiced sorrow. "This is so hard," she began, her voice a near whisper. "Seeing my sister and the woman she looks up to as a mother being torn apart like this, it's heartbreaking." She looked at me, her gaze unwavering and full of what looked like genuine empathy. "Margaret, James's will, it was a cruel thing. I don't know what he was thinking, but he's laid a trap for all of us. He's poisoning this family from the grave." She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table, the picture of earnest sincerity. I understand your position. I truly do. You want to protect James's legacy. You want to feel secure. And Clara, she's a young widow trying to find her footing, terrified of losing her home and her son's stability. This document is forcing you both into impossible corners. I said nothing, merely gripping my warm mug. I knew this was the preamble, the carefully constructed opening argument. So I've been thinking, she continued, her voice dropping conspiratorially, as if she were letting me in on a brilliant secret. There has to be a better way, a way for everyone to win, a way to do what's really best for the most important person in this equation, Lucas. She paused, letting the boy's name hang in the air like a sacred invocation. Here's my proposal. Let's take the will out of the equation entirely. Let's do the right thing, the noble thing. We sell the house. I know it's painful, but it's just bricks and mortar. We take every single penny from the sale, all $2 million, and we put it into an ironclad trust fund for Lucas. It will be untouchable until he turns 18 or 21 for college. And to ensure everything is fair, you and Clara will be named as co-trustees, equal partners in managing his future. She sat back, a soft, benevolent smile on her face, as if she had just solved world peace. Clara and I will find a new place to live, a fresh start. You'll be free from this terrible burden, free to find your own peace without this house hanging over your head. Clara gets her freedom. You get your peace of mind. And Lucas's future is secured beyond any doubt. We all win. The proposal was a work of art. It was so perfectly reasonable, so incredibly selfless, that it left me breathless. It was a checkmate move delivered with a gentle smile. She had built a beautiful golden cage of logic and morality and was holding the door wide open for me. If I said yes, I would lose the house, the last bastion of my family's history, and be forced into a financial partnership with the very woman I suspected of wrongdoing. If I said no, I would be the monster. I would be the selfish, greedy old woman who cared more about a piece of property than her own grandson's future. I would prove their entire narrative correct in one fell swoop. She had handed me a shovel and dared me to dig my own grave. For the first time since this nightmare began, a sliver of genuine doubt pierced my resolve. I looked at Eleanor, at her calm, compassionate face, and a terrifying question echoed in my mind. What if she's right? What if I'm the one who's wrong? Eleanor's perfectly reasonable, perfectly poisonous offer was the final push I needed. I was backed into a corner, just as James had predicted. The next morning, my hands trembling slightly, I retrieved the small brass key from my jewelry box. Its cold, solid weight was a small comfort, a final connection to my son. The U.S. Bank building downtown was an imposing structure of granite and glass, a temple dedicated to commerce. The safe deposit vault was in the basement, behind a circular steel door that looked like it could withstand a direct missile strike. The whole process was cold and clinical. A guard checked my ID, I signed a ledger, and he used his key in conjunction with mine to access the box. He slid out the long, narrow metal container and left me alone in the small, sterile viewing booth. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was half expecting a letter, a final emotional confession from James explaining everything. But when I lifted the lid, there was no letter. There was no sentiment. Inside lay a thick manila folder, bulging with financial statements, and a single black USB flash drive. That was it. I didn't look at the contents there. I took the folder and the drive, put them in my handbag, and walked out of the bank into the gray Portland afternoon, feeling more alone than ever. That night, after Lucas was asleep and the house was shrouded in silence, I poured myself a glass of scotch I didn't drink and sat down at the large oak desk in my study. With the glow of a single desk lamp cutting through the darkness, I opened the folder. It was a nightmare in black and white. The documents chronicled the slow, systematic bleeding of my son's construction company. For hours, I waded through a swamp of balance sheets, wire transfer receipts, and LLC formation documents. It was all tied to a single, disastrous venture, a luxury condominium development in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was a money pit, and James had been pouring millions into it. The company I thought was a thriving legacy was nothing more than a hollowed-out shell, teetering on the brink of catastrophic bankruptcy. My son hadn't just been stressed. He had been drowning. But why? James was a smart, cautious businessman. He would never have gambled the family business on such a risky, speculative project. Someone must have been advising him, pushing him. I sifted through the legal paperwork, the partnership agreements, my eyes scanning for a name, a clue. And then I found it, on page after page of authorizations for high-risk capital transfers, on the legal opinions greenlighting the flow of money out of the company and into the Arizona black hole. There was a signature. It was the signature of the legal counsel who had reviewed and approved every single disastrous transaction. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a dizzying wave of nausea. The signature was elegant, familiar, and utterly damning. It belonged to Arthur Blake. The Scotch glass slipped from my numb fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor. But I barely heard it. The world had shrunk to that single, looping signature on the page. Arthur, the trusted family friend, the man who had looked so worried at the funeral, the man who had warned me not to trust him. It wasn't a warning. It was a confession. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with brutal force. The failing company, the immense financial pressure on James, the stress that the doctor had mentioned. It all led back to this. Arthur hadn't just been a bystander. He had been an architect of my son's ruin. The betrayal was a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I was no longer just fighting for a house. I was standing in the middle of a conspiracy that had not only bankrupted my son, but had quite possibly killed him. And the only man I thought I could turn to for help was one of them. The discovery of Arthur's betrayal left me reeling. For 2 days, I walked through my life in a daze, the knowledge of his treachery a toxic poison seeping into my every thought. My only moments of peace were the ones I spent with Lucas. He was my anchor, the one pure, innocent soul in this sprawling, ugly mess. That evening, we were curled up in the big armchair in his bedroom, the soft glow of his bedside lamp casting a warm circle of light around us. I was reading him a classic adventure story, my voice a low, steady murmur, but my mind was a million miles away, lost in the labyrinth of financial documents and legal signatures. We were at a part in the story where the hero was trekking across a vast, sun-baked desert. I finished the chapter and was about to close the book when Lucas, who had been quiet and sleepy, suddenly piped up. "Grandma," he asked, his voice small and thoughtful, "is Arizona pretty?" The question was so random, so out of the blue, that it took me a second to register. "Arizona?" I repeated, looking down at him. "I suppose so. It's very different from here. Lots of sunshine and desert. Why do you ask, sweetie?" He snuggled deeper into my side, his head resting on my arm. "Aunt Eleanor shows Mommy pictures of it on her computer sometimes," he said, his words slightly muffled by my sleeve. "Lots of pictures of big houses with bright blue swimming pools." A knot of unease began to tighten in my stomach. I tried to keep my voice light, casual. "Oh, really? That sounds nice." "Yeah," he continued, his childish innocence a stark contrast to the cold dread creeping up my spine. "Auntie says that when we move there, Mommy will be happy again. She says Mommy will smile a lot more when she gets to be with Uncle Richard." The book slipped from my numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. I didn't notice. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My entire world narrowed to a single point, a single name, spoken with the guileless honesty of a 9-year-old boy. Richard. The name wasn't new to me. It was the name I had seen buried deep within the paperwork from the safe deposit box. Richard Vance. He was the principal developer on the Scottsdale, Arizona project. He was the owner of the LLC that my son's company had been pouring millions of dollars into. I had assumed he was just a business partner, a faceless entity at the center of my son's financial ruin. But he wasn't. He was Uncle Richard. In that instant, the final devastating piece of the puzzle slid into place. My heart, which had felt like a lead weight for days, began to beat with a terrible, frantic clarity. This was never just about the house. The house was a distraction, a sideshow. This was about liquidating the entire company, bankrupting it, and funneling the last of its assets into a project owned by Clara's lover. It was a heist, a grand, audacious plan to steal everything, erase the company, and escape to a new life in the sun, paid for with my son's legacy. Eleanor wasn't just manipulating her sister for a piece of the inheritance. She was orchestrating a complete and total robbery. And Clara wasn't a pawn. She was a willing accomplice, dreaming of swimming pools and a new life with a new man. I looked down at my grandson, now drifting off to sleep, and a feeling I hadn't felt since James's death rose up inside me. It was a cold, pure, and diamond-hard rage. The fog of grief and confusion that had clouded my mind for weeks finally burned away. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a grieving mother lost in a maze. I finally saw the full picture, and I knew exactly who my enemies were, what they had done, and what they planned to do next. And I would be damned if I let them get away with it. Rage is a powerful clarifying agent. It burned away my fear and replaced it with a cold, hard resolve. I was done reacting, done being managed and manipulated. It was my turn to make a move. The next morning, I hired a private investigator. He was a former Portland police detective with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Exactly the kind of man who wouldn't be fooled by a pretty face or a well-rehearsed sob story. I gave him one target, Eleanor. I wanted to know everything, who she met, where she went, who she talked to. I wanted her life under a microscope. It took less than a week. The call came on a Friday afternoon. "Got something for you?" the investigator, a man named Brody, said in his gravelly voice. "Your target has a dinner reservation tonight, 8 o'clock. Table for 2 at the Heathman Hotel. The other party's name is Richard Vance." The Heathman, one of the most elegant high-end hotels in the city, a public place for a very private conspiracy. It was perfect. A plan began to form in my mind, not born of panic, but of cold, calculated strategy. I was no longer the prey. I was the hunter, and it was time to rattle the cage. That evening, I took my time getting ready. I chose a charcoal gray silk dress, understated but elegant, and a string of pearls my husband had given me for our 30th anniversary. I styled my hair and applied my makeup with a steady hand, but when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes weren't filled with grief. They were filled with ice. I arrived at the hotel at 8:15. Fashionably late for my own fictional appointment. The lobby was a symphony of quiet luxury, low lighting, polished dark wood, the soft notes of a piano drifting from the lounge. I gave the hostess a charming smile and told her I was meeting a friend who was running late, and that I would just wait in the bar. From a small, secluded table, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the main dining room. And there they were. They were seated at a corner table. their heads close together in intimate conversation over glasses of white wine. They looked like any other affluent couple discussing a business deal or planning a vacation. But I saw them for what they were, a pair of vultures picking over the bones of my son's life. I waited another 10 minutes, letting them get comfortable, letting them feel safe. Then, I stood up, smoothed down my dress, and began to walk through the dining room as if I were heading for the exit on the far side. I charted my course directly past their table. As I drew near, I let my eyes drift in their direction, and then widened them in a flawless imitation of surprise and delight. Eleanor saw me first. Her back stiffened, and a flicker of alarm crossed her face before her perfect mask of composure slammed back into place. I stopped beside their table, my smile warm and friendly. I ignored Eleanor completely. My eyes were locked on her companion. "Richard, isn't it?" I said, my voice bright and clear. "Richard Vance. My goodness, what a small world." He looked up at me, his face a canvas of confusion and dawning panic. He clearly had no idea who I was. "I'm Margaret Holloway," I continued, extending a hand he didn't take. "James's mother. Oh, he spoke of you so often. He was so passionate about that project in Arizona. He poured his heart and soul into it." I let my smile become a little sad, a little wistful. It's such a terrible shame he isn't here to see it through to its successful conclusion. Every word was a carefully aimed dart. I saw the color drain from Richard's face. He looked like a cornered animal. But it was Eleanor's reaction that I would never forget. For one split second, the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Her serene, therapeutic gaze vanished, and in its place was a flash of pure, unadulterated loathing. It was the look of a predator whose hunt had just been interrupted. It was murderous. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. She was all smiles and sympathy again. But I had seen it. I had seen the monster behind the mask. "Well," I said, my cheerful act unwavering, "I won't interrupt your dinner. So lovely to finally meet you, Richard." I gave them one last, brilliant smile and continued on my way, walking calmly out of the restaurant without a single look back. I didn't need to. I had delivered my message. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and for the first time, they knew that I was a player in the game, and I was playing to win. The family courtroom was a cold, sterile environment, all beige walls and unflattering fluorescent lighting. It was a place designed to strip emotion away, to reduce life's most passionate conflicts to a series of motions and exhibits. But the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Clara and Eleanor sat at the opposing table, flanked by a slick, expensive-looking lawyer. Eleanor was a pillar of calm sorrow. Clara just looked terrified. My own lawyer, a sharp woman named Ms. Davies, had presented our case first. We laid out the financial documents, the trail of money flowing to Richard Vance's company in Arizona, the evidence of my son's company being systematically drained. But Clara's lawyer was good. He spun it all with practiced ease. He painted me as a grieving, paranoid old woman, unable to accept her son's unfortunate but legitimate business failures, now lashing out and trying to steal her grandson from his loving, devoted mother. He had photos of Clara and Lucas at the park, testimonials from teachers about what a wonderful, involved parent she was. He was building a compelling narrative, and I could feel our case starting to slip through our fingers. "The defense calls Arthur Blake to the stand," Ms. Davies announced, and a ripple of surprise went through the room. Arthur walked slowly to the witness box, avoiding my gaze. I had confronted him 2 days earlier in his office, laying the evidence from the safe deposit box on his desk. I hadn't yelled. I had simply told him that he could either tell the truth in court or become a co-conspirator in the fraud that killed my son? Under Ms. Davies's careful questioning, he confessed. He spoke in a low, defeated voice, admitting that he had been professionally compromised. He explained how Richard and Eleanor had used a past business dealing he'd made a mistake on as leverage, effectively blackmailing him into signing off on the transfers. "They had me over a barrel," he mumbled. "I saw what they were doing to James's company, to James himself. The stress was killing him, but I was trapped." His testimony was a bombshell, and Clara's lawyers scrambled to discredit him on cross-examination, but the damage was done. The financial motive was now firmly linked to Eleanor. Still, it was his word against hers. It wasn't quite enough. "Your Honor," Ms. Davies said, her voice ringing with confidence, "we have one final piece of evidence to submit. It was left to my client by her son." She held up the small black USB drive. The opposing lawyer immediately jumped to his feet, objecting loudly. But the judge, her interest clearly piqued by Arthur's testimony, overruled him. A bailiff took the drive and inserted it into a laptop connected to the large monitors on the courtroom walls. The screens flickered to life. The image was shaky at first, then focused. It was my son, my James, but he was a ghost of himself, pale and gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. He was sitting in his home office, the one I was now using as a war room. He looked directly into the camera, his gaze piercing and filled with a terrible, weary clarity. "If you're watching this," he began, his voice raspy but strong, "it means I'm dead, and it means Eleanor got what she wanted. Almost." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Clara stared at the screen, her hand flying to her mouth. "This headache, this pressure in my head, it's not natural," James continued, his eyes burning with intensity. "Eleanor, you won. You twisted Clara around your finger. You convinced her to help you destroy my company from the inside. And you've been slowly killing me with whatever is in that special vitamin blend you've been giving me every day for my stress." He took a ragged breath. "You played the long game. You manipulated my wife. You bankrupted my legacy. And you took my life. But you will not get my son. You will not profit from my death. This is my last will and testament. The real one." The video ended. The screen went black. For a heartbeat, the courtroom was utterly silent. Then the dam broke. A raw, animalistic scream tore from Clara's throat. She launched herself to her feet, her chair clattering to the floor, and turned on her sister. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. "What did you do to him?" But Eleanor didn't answer. She sat frozen in her chair, staring at the blank screen. Her perfect angelic mask had been incinerated, leaving behind the cold, empty face of a monster caught in the light. Tears streamed down my own face, hot and silent. They weren't tears of sorrow or loss. They were tears of righteous, burning relief. Justice for my son had finally been served. 6 months later, the world had been reborn. The relentless Oregon rain had finally given way to a brilliant, sun-drenched spring. The oppressive gray that had hung over the house for so long had lifted, replaced by a sky of impossible blue. On the lake, sunlight danced across the water like a million scattered diamonds. The air, once thick with secrets and sorrow, was now fresh with the scent of damp earth, new grass, and the sweet perfume of cherry blossoms drifting from the trees. I stood on the wide back porch, a warm mug of coffee in my hands, and watched my grandson. Lucas was down by the water's edge, completely absorbed in the serious business of launching a small, folded paper boat into the gentle currents. He was laughing, a pure, clear sound that was more beautiful than any bird song. The haunted, anxious look that had shadowed his small face for months was gone, replaced by the simple, uncomplicated joy of a 9-year-old boy on a perfect spring morning. He was healing. We both were. The mail had come earlier, and resting on the small table beside me was a letter. The envelope was plain. The return address a P.O. box for the Columbia River Correctional Institution. It was from Clara. My first instinct had been to throw it, unread, into the fireplace, but my curiosity, and perhaps a final, lingering shred of pity, had won out. Her letter wasn't an apology. It didn't ask for forgiveness or make excuses for her greed. Instead, it was a flat, emotionless recounting of a life spent in her sister's shadow. She wrote of how Eleanor had always been the smart one, the pretty one, the one who could twist any situation, any person, to her will. Clara had been Eleanor's first and most enduring project. The letter was a confession not of her crimes, but of her own weakness, a lifetime of being told what to think, what to want, and who to be. The final paragraph was the only one that held any real emotion. "I know I don't deserve to ask you for anything," she wrote. "But please, when Lucas is old enough, just tell him that his mother was weak, not evil. And tell him that in my own broken way, I really did love him." I folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. I didn't know if I could ever grant her that request, but I understood it. She was both a villain and a victim, a casualty of a war that had been raging long before I ever knew it existed. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the tall fir trees surrounding the property. This house, which had once felt like a prison, a battlefield, now felt like a sanctuary again. It was no longer just a collection of wood and stone. It was a fortress that had protected my grandson's future. It was a testament to a father's desperate, last-ditch effort to save his son. I whispered the words into the warm air, a final conversation with my son. "Oh, James, you were wrong about one thing. In your will, you pushed me into the ring to fight for him." I smiled, a real, genuine smile, as I watched Lucas chase a butterfly along the shoreline. But it wasn't me who kept him safe in the end. It was you. And this house. This house is now the keeper of your legacy. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.